Hello everybody. In this video, I'd like to share with you a book recommendation. So whether you are interested in starting to learn Latin or you are already studying Latin for some time, I think you should know this Latin grammar book written by Rosenstock-Huessy. This book doesn't follow the traditional methods of Latin grammar because it starts by recommending that students read excerpts of medieval Latin. Of course, it will approach classic Latin later, but one of its differences lies exactly in this point. It starts with medieval Latin and not the classic Latin. I do not think it is one of the greatest grammar books. In fact, it is not. You can find better grammar books that offer all the subtle rules of Latin. But I think I could say that this book, this grammar book, surpasses all Latin books. If not by his method, at least by the brilliant insights of Rosenstock, which are spread throughout the book. First of all, let me very briefly explain who Rosenstock was, and then I will address two passages from this book. So I think that is the closest pronunciation I'm able to give of his name. Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy was a historian and social philosopher, and his work deals with theology, sociology, and linguistics. He was involved in deep research on speech and language. For instance, he is the writer of a book called The Origin of Speech, which is a funny title since you cannot help but relate it to The Origin of Speeches by Charles Darwin. But anyway, if you're interested in knowing more about this book, The Origin of Speech, this great book, you can read a series of notes based on this book through the link I put in the description of the video. And I'm sure you'll be amazed. Now, regarding Latin, I have to say that Rosenstock decided to write this grammar book after his son flunked in Latin, failed in Latin. He thought that there were some problems with the methods of teaching this dead language in his time. I'd like to read a passage from another book of Rosenstock called Teaching Too Late, Learning Too Early, where he explains the motive of his grammar. So, open quotes. Nobody learns Latin today because nobody expects great things anymore from reading Latin texts. To help remedy this, I myself have written a Latin textbook which centers upon rousing great expectancies. But of course I cannot find a publisher for it today when standardized tests and college board examinations take the place of expectancy. After reading his Latin grammar book, I assure you that his grammar really rouses expectancy. I found the way he starts the book very interesting because he recommends the student, right at the beginning, to memorize some Latin songs, in this case, Christian songs and also prayers. I have been studying Latin myself for some time, and it is a point I don't see being properly emphasized, stressed, the importance of memorization. At the beginning, even if you don't understand what is the meaning of a paragraph or of a sentence, but it's very important to memorize, to have it in your memory, even because of the pronunciation, right? But as I said at the beginning, I'd like to read two passages from this grammar, two excerpts from his grammar. And they are not likely one of the most important passages, but I myself found them very, very interesting, very important. For instance, have you ever contemplated the possibility of negation in language? Have you ever perceived the mystery of negation? So take a look at what Rosenstock says. So here in a paragraph where he talks about negation, he starts with a Latin sentence. Vera hominis virtus noscitur ex potentia negandi. Then he gives the translation. Man's most manly function becomes known from his power to say no. And he goes on. If anybody in everyday life should forget or overlook the productive and destructive processes that are carried out through speech and thought, the existence of the word no should remind him of his blunder. Then another sentence in Latin. Nulla res omni modo non est sicut res frigida undique frigida non est, sed minus tepida con alia. And he gives a translation. It's a complicated sentence. There is a play here with the words, with the negation. Nothing really exists, not at all. As little as a cold thing is all cold, it only is less warm than other things. Everything in the physical world has a breath of warmth in it. When we call it cold, we judge its temperature in relation to warmer things. Whenever we say, oh, this is not, we really throw a thing out of our realm of thought. We ask it to leave us alone. We decide a place which that which we deny holds in our world. It, however, has not simply disappeared. It only shrinks in importance. So in this paragraph, he's showing how the negation expresses different kinds of relations. Right? Moving on now, another Latin sentence. Cum negemus strigas esse, ille res ex quibus ali strigas esse judicaverunt, a nobis aliter explicantur. The translation, when we deny the existence of witches, we explain that which leads other people to believe in witches in a different way. Then he gives another example based on this sentence. When we say, there is no God, we only say that the processes which lead the rest of mankind from the day of man's creation to this belief do not suffice in our eyes to condense them into one universal name valid for all. We deny God's name, not the reality of the soul's processes. And here it's another sentence. I will read first the Latin sentence. Negamus nomen Dei, non possumus negare anime commotionis, quibus efficitur ut ex abundantia cordis os loquatur. The translation. We deny God's name, not the reality of the soul's processes which flood the heart so that the mouth speaks. There is then a special awe and daring about negation. Then a sentence in Latin. Antiquis hic verborum quibus negamus, tremor atque stupor perspicui erant. Quia utitur verbis non ne non quin, homo iude ex mundi et reformatur societatis segerit. Here we don't have the translation, but it's something like I'm translating in English. It's more difficult for me. In ancient times, these words were always expressed by fear and wonder. Because man makes use of these words, these negative words, non, ne, num, quin, because man makes use of these words, he behaves as if he were the judge of the world and the reformator of society. Oh, these profound insights with negation. We don't pay attention at the negation, it's so simple, so obvious. But here we have the insides of Rosenstock-Huessy. Let me see here. Okay, now I would like to read another passage wherein Rosenstock is mapping the development of language. It is a longer quotation, but I think you will enjoy it a moment. Okay, so going on. He says, we have seen that Romans generally used sounds which are also found in modern European languages. The real difference between classical antiquity and the Christian era stems from the fact that the sounds were dealt with in a different manner, and no wonder, for the daily blurring of sound syllables, words, and sentences through 2,000 years has used up the linguistic material like a stream washing out the rocks of its bed. Furthermore, the proportions among the various uses to which a language is put have completely changed today. What do we mean by this change of proportions? In antiquity, the main use of language was in prayer, in military command, in law, and in singing, whereas today language is infinitely more used for the ephemeral purposes of everyday speech, press, private letters, telephone calls, broadcasting, and the like. Now, these different branches of human speech are intoned in different ways. The history of intonation leads from plain chant to whisper. Religious intonation, and similarly legal and military and craftsmen's use of language, are most explicit. In fiction, gossip, talk, correspondence, commerce, journalism, the half and quarter tones prevail. So here he is explaining the intonation, right? And then he finishes this paragraph saying, prayer is uttered in a plain chant. Hebrew prayer and the Roman Catholic Mass simply preserve this oldest layer of human speech. They help us to understand the original principles of Latin pronunciation. This primary intonation we call plain chant. Plain chant is an attitude halfway between the singing of an artist and everyday speech. In plain chant, as used in the Mass and in the synagogue, we probably have the manner of speech that is nearest the primeval values of speech. Compared to plain chant, our oral efforts are a kind of shorthand in speech. The way in which we articulate and move our larynx, tongue, gums, etc. is a mere shadow of the light that flooded the old language when man first cried to God. And then he draws a chart. So on the top center, you have plain chant. On the left side, on the side of plain, you have from top to bottom prayer, military command, law, crafts, rhetoric, and then correspondence, fiction, journalism, commerce, and talk, and gossip. On the right of the chant, so plain chant is on the top center, it's on the top center, plain chant, top center. On the right side, now on the side of chant, you have melody, and then vocal music, instrumental music, and then the single instruments of our orchestras. It is very interesting. As I said, he's talking about the progress and development of language and classification. Here we have, I think, an explanation, a better way to understand that chart. So he says, from plain chant to broadcast. In 3000 before Christ. Plain chant, music, and speech were undivided. Gestures, dances, and plain chant went together in all community ceremonies. This we may call the loud voice. Between individuals, the full gesticulation used in public was probably omitted. The still small voice, as the Bible calls it, was used. This still small voice comes to the fore. After 1500 BC, speech and music separated. A nucleus of plain chant remained for prayer, law, and oratory. This may be called the hieratic layer. After music split off, it eventually separated into instrumental and vocal music. At the same time, the still small speech is split into poetry, epic, lyric, and drama, and prose, mathematics, history, and philosophy. For Latin, about 500 and 600 BC, the written language entered the scene as a language-changing power. After oral speech became supplemented by written documents, 4 types of expression together with their combinations resulted. Oral, improvised. Oral, memorized. Written, read aloud. Written, read silently. We modern men think that type 4, written, read silently, is the regular type. Originally, it was used only for doctrinal, scientific, or historical traditions. Type 3 has been used for poetry and for all hieratic texts once they are written down, although even then most of them are recited in plain chant. This means that they have been handed down from generation to generation by immediate oral transmission, while the written documents have been used only as an aide-memoire. I think help of memory, support of memory. Not to tell the whole story of how to pronounce the texts. Type 2 is the genuine way of speaking in slogans, proverbs, and formulas. How do you do? Talk develops by jocose variations of such a formula of quotation. And type 1 bears the genuine power of creative language now restricted to prophetic language, speaking in tongues. This faded at the end of the pre-Christian era in the last oracles and Sibylline books and similar ecstasies. Women in their dirges were especially apt to preserve programmatical, ecstatic cries and yells. When Paul said, "Let the women be silent in the church," he was probably turning against the shouting and yelling still in use today among Jewish women at time of death. Thereby he paved the way for the real emancipation of women to public speaking, whereas before they represented an articulate element. So here we have 2 passages, 2 excerpts from his book that I enjoyed very much, and that is it. That's the recommendation. Thank you for watching.